What if Jethro Tull played the Delta Blues? This week I'll be taking a look at the long and storied career of Jethro Tull, a band who are almost impossible to pigeonhole. And I'll also be thinking about the enduring appeal of the Delta Blues, a genre to which certain listeners seem to attach an almost mystical importance. All this and more on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hi, my name is Morgan Brown, and every Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel, and then on Wednesdays I produce one of these companion videos where I discuss the artists and genres involved and also share a little bit of an insight into my recording and arranging process. The idea of my What If videos is that each week I pick a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. Then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I happen to have to hand in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week, as per reviewer request, was Locomotive Breath by Jethro Tull. I attempted to transform that into a sort of 1930s Delta Blues recording. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. See the children jumping off stations one by one. This woman and his best friend in bed and having fun. Going hard and down the corridor, on his hands and knees, on his sofa and up, and praying and wants to go and know his books up and down. So, as I say, this week's What If video was from a request by one of my regular viewers, Acro Dave, who is ever present with the witty and interesting comments and has also provided quite a few fun suggestions for the channel in the past. So I was happy to oblige by trying to at least make this one come to fruition as well. It's an interesting one for me, really, because although they definitely connect to a lot of things that I am really into, I've never really delved too much into Jethro Tull. I think, like a lot of other metalheads who were listening to Metallica in the late 80s, I was probably put off them by the fact that it was one of their albums that famously beat out And Justice for All for the Best Metal Album of the Year Grammy, 1989, I think, thereabouts. Certainly in the metal community at the time, it caused quite a stir because people were just flabbergasted that A, you would consider Jethro Tull to be metal in any way, and then B, that anything that they were doing by the late 80s would be considered to be more important than this sort of towering achievement in thrash metal. So I'm sure at the time that probably prejudiced me against them. So I never really deliberately dived into their music. I've obviously over the years heard probably more than I realise. I've definitely enjoyed quite a few of the bits that I have heard. Somehow I've just never quite got around to them, but looking at their career again in advance of doing this video has made me think again, I really do need to actually properly check this band out in a bit more depth. So maybe this time I will actually follow through on that and do so. They're really interesting and quite unique, and one of the few bands that you really kind of would struggle to put in a specific pigeonhole, because although they've always sounded very much like Jethro Tull, whatever phase they've been in, they've covered an awful lot of musical ground. Started out, I think, about 1968. That first album, This Was, is sort of a bit of an outlier in a way, as far as I can tell from their discography, because it's the only one that's got the original guitarist Mick Abrams on, and he was a big blues enthusiast. So that album actually has some stuff that veers towards the kind of blues territory that I was attempting to do with my What If this week. But it's an interesting listen, that record, because you can feel the band pulling in these two different directions, with Mick Abrams pulling towards more bluesy stuff and Ian Anderson pulling towards more sort of jazzy, slightly more musically ambitious kind of stuff. You can definitely sense some tension there, and that must have been the case because after they released that album, Mick Abrams left to start Bloodwind Pig, where he could go and be as bluesy as he wanted. And then from that point on, you kind of get them fully developing into the Jethro Tull that we generally know and love. And you get this sound developing that from record to record changes and fluctuates, but it always has all these similar elements in greater or lesser quantities. So there's probably still some blues in there, but now it's balanced out by a lot more folk. There's definitely always some jazz in there, Mick Abrams is replaced by Martin Barr, who brings some kind of proper crunching, kind of heavy rock weight with his guitar playing. And they also have a strong kind of progressive element to them too. Quite lengthy and ambitious tracks, some interesting rhythmic stuff, some quite elaborate use of keyboards and things. But they never quite fit into any of these sort of categories exactly. You wouldn't really call them a folk rock group because they're a bit too prog for that. You wouldn't call them a prog group necessarily because they somehow don't seem to quite fit with the more lofty neoclassical ambitions of a bunch of the other prog bands. They've got some jazz fusion elements, but you wouldn't call them a fusion band. They just fit somewhere between all those things in their own little bubble, really, and I find that pretty fascinating. Ian Anderson as well as an utterly unique frontman. My initial impression of the band was possibly coloured by Ian Anderson's onstage persona as well, the kind of wild-eyed, standing on one leg while playing the flute kind of thing. I guess if you're a 10-year-old thrash metal fan, that all seems a bit too much, but I kind of made peace with it nowadays, and he's tremendously charismatic. Powerful singer who can definitely conjure as much sort of rock power as you need, but never falls into the kind of Americanisms that other rock singers of his generation tend to. He always actually sounds like he's from Britain, which is refreshing, which again reinforces that sort of more folky feel to their sound. The fact that he uses the flute so prominently as well is really interesting because it's not an instrument that crops up a great deal in rock music, but just totally adds a unique texture to their sound that none of their contemporaries really had. So yeah, a band that I've definitely overlooked for too long, and one that I feel like I must check out properly rather than just sort of dipping into things here and there. So if anyone watching does have any recommendations of particular things that I should check out, do let me know, because I always appreciate guidance from people who know a bit more than me about these things. But as I say, one thing that I did make sure to have a listen to before making this video was that first album, where there's a much more pronounced blues influence. And I guess at the time, the whole UK rock scene was absolutely enthralled to the blues. I guess loads of bands were drawing pretty heavily on the Chicago blues sound, but also I think that's the era when an awful lot of the myth building around the earlier Delta blues sound kind of really started in earnest, with the likes of Cream covering Crossroads by Robert Johnson, the Stones doing Love in Vain. There's definitely a feeling of these white musicians trying to imbue their music with some of this aura of the classic blues recordings from the 20s and 30s. I think ever since then, Delta blues has been synonymous with the idea of authenticity in music. It's like, if you're a fan of the blues and you want to prove that you really know your stuff, it's important that the thing you're most into is the real authentic old school Delta blues, none of your slick modern stuff. Nothing electric, nothing orchestrated, nothing poppy or catchy. It's got to be raw and it's got to be direct and it's got to be ideally from the Mississippi Delta, that kind of idea. But as I think I've said several times on this channel before, the idea of authenticity in music, it's a tricky one to grasp. I mean, rock music has long been obsessed with it, but what isn't authentic is often a matter of perception rather than fact, I think. A lot of audiences, particularly white audiences, who are attracted to the idea of Delta blues as this sort of epitome of authenticity, I think can end up almost sort of fetishizing certain aspects of the music and performers and the culture in a way that can inadvertently end up being a bit racist. Like the whole mythology, particularly around Robert Johnson, the pact with the devil at the crossroads to become a legendary guitarist and all this. And then the kind of obsession over very specific elements of style and very specific elements of subject matter of the blues as well, which can be quite reductive, I think. They're kind of transforming what was quite a lively and interesting and diverse form of music into just this mythologized idea of the supernaturally talented, suffering black man with his slide guitar playing these spooky, lonesome songs. And, you know, some of the music is that. But there was no one single definitive Delta blues sound. The Mississippi Delta and the blues scene produced a wide range of performers with different vocal styles, different guitar styles. And even within a single artist's repertoire, you know, it tends to be much more than just one style. I mean, Charlie Patton absolutely could do spine-chilling, bleak, miserable blues, but he could also do stuff you could dance to. Robert Johnson, the same. Even his vocal style varies wildly depending on what kind of stuff he's doing. There's up-tempo, finger-popping stuff that sounds almost like proto-rock and roll, but then there's also the chill-inducing kind of deep blues that people obsess over. So I think in particularly white audiences latching onto Delta blues, they've attempted to boil it down to the elements that they consider to be most authentic. They've actually kind of reduced it from a much broader and more interesting style. Anyway, that takes me up to this week's alternative universe scenario. So in my alternate timeline this week, things are largely the same as in our universe, except that Ian Anderson and Martin Barr were both born sort of 40-something years earlier than they were in our own timeline. So we're back in, I guess, the 1920s, and the two of them are folk musicians, itinerant folk musicians, just travelling around the British Isles, trying to earn their keep. But times are hard for travelling minstrels in those days. No one's particularly interested. There are newer, more sophisticated forms of entertainment, and folk music isn't a particularly big deal. So they decide to brave an ocean voyage across the Atlantic to go and try and find their fortune in the US. So off they go, land in the States. Unfortunately, they don't fare much better over there. They travel from city to city, plying their trade, but no one's particularly interested in what they're doing. And over the next couple of years, they gradually work from city to city, getting further and further south until eventually they find themselves in the sorry position of having to work as casual field labourers down in Mississippi. The one upside of this is that they do find themselves getting along very well with their co-workers, most of whom are black, and several of whom are musicians. And the music that they play is the blues. And now Ian and Martin have never heard this before, but they're really intrigued by this exciting new style of music. And being musicians themselves, they quickly start to pick that up. And pretty soon they're quite fluent in the language of the blues. They're playing and singing it. They've started writing their own songs in this style. And a little while later, they see a notice up saying that a talent scout from a record company is coming to a nearby town and they're holding open auditions, so they're very excited. They pick up their guitars and head into town and play for this talent scout. Martin on the guitar and harmonica, and Ian singing, obviously, and playing slide. And the talent scout's very impressed. He really likes their original song, Locomotive Breath, and he's like, right, we're going to cut this right now. We're going to make a record of that. The one slight snag is that he figures it's a blues record, so it's going to be considered to be a race record, as they were known in those days. But the idea of a duo of white men performing a race record is completely unheard of, and that's not really going to wash in the still very segregated southern US of the day. So he suggests that instead of being billed as the duo that they are, that they come up with a pseudonym. So Anderson and Barr have a bit of a chat amongst themselves and eventually come up with a name, which is actually the name of the inventor of the horse-drawn seed drill, Jethro Tull. So from that day forth, the duo go by the guise of the bluesman Jethro Tull, and that's how their record is released. So, in attempting to convert Locomotive Breath into a vintage Delta Blues type record, the first step as ever is just getting the original lead vocal into GarageBand, syncing up to the grid so it's nice and in time. That done, I set about putting some instruments on. Now, I wanted to keep things fairly stark as we're going for that sort of pared down folk blues sound. You don't want a full band on there. But I did want just something to kind of mark the rhythm. So instead of a drum kit, I wanted it to sound like it was just, if you've got two performers, maybe one of them tapping their foot and one of them just tapping their foot on a tambourine. So we've got an on-beat and an off-beat. So I think I actually used a bass drum, but just with most of the bass taken out, so it does just sound a bit like a tapping foot. And then a tambourine from the same drum kit, just to kind of keep a really steady, really simple rhythm going throughout. Once that was on there, the next step was just some guitar, acoustic guitar. So I've got one track of it just finger picking away, keeping the chords going with a couple of little more melodic fills in there too. It's fairly rough and ready, but we're talking about trying to recreate the sound of a one-take performance from the 20s or 30s, so I figured if it's slightly clunky, that's okay. It's the best take they got that day, so. got a reasonable take of that, and then I did a second guitar just playing slide. I'm not very good at slide guitar, but I did my best to just sort of add some little bits of slide on there, starting in the second verse, so there's a little bit of a build-up and just kind of weaving in and out of the vocal there. And then the last instrument that I added was a bit of harmonica. I'm not sure who it was who played the harmonica on that first Jethro Tull album, but there's some really good harmonica on there. I'm not that good, but I did my best just to add some little bluesy phrases in and around the vocal again, building up the texture of the track and adding another flavour in there too. So we've got all our instruments on there. What I then wanted to do was to try and make it sound like it was an old recording, and what we're listening to now has been recovered from a dusty old 78 record. So I went into the EQ and just tried to EQ everything so that it had that limited dynamic range that you get from old records. So took off a lot of the bass frequencies, quite a lot of the top end, middle hump in the EQ, so you get that slightly boxy, slightly harsh sound that you get from an old record. I also, to compound that impression, added on a track of vinyl crackle. I guess it would have been shellac crackle on a 78, but same idea. So it's just a proper dusty sounding, battered up old record that still just about plays.
In the shuffling madness of the locomotive breath.
Then for the video, as ever, started out by just getting some live footage of Jethro Tull performing the song back in the day. I tried to cut out most of the band because in this theoretical version of Jethro Tull, it is just Ian and Martin. So I zoomed in as close as possible on those two. And then obviously they're a full electric band on those performances, so I wanted some acoustic instruments in there. It's very difficult to find decent footage of old bluesmen on YouTube now because it's been so taken over by AI bullshit. So much AI slop, just pretend bluesmen, horrible AI videos, horrible AI music, absolutely the worst, hate it. So I had to wade through loads of that, but eventually found some cool footage of Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee, who I know are not actually Delta blues musicians, but they've got a great look for what I was going for. So we've got them playing, so I've got an acoustic guitar and a harmonica player there. We've got some people dancing as well, which I thought added to the atmosphere, which is nice. And then I also wanted a separate guitarist doing the slide, so I found some cool old footage of Son House. So we've got his slide in there as well to represent those bits. Cut all those together and just added a filter to make everything look even older and grainier than it was and nice and black and white. So hopefully that makes the whole thing hang together a little bit better. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this one. As I say, I do know that Jethro Tull did actually dabble in some fairly straight-ahead blues stuff early on, but trying to make it into very specifically this kind of late 20s, early 30s recorded folk blues was a really fun challenge. So thanks for that suggestion, Dave. It was a good one. And I enjoyed finding out a bit more about Jethro Tull too. If you did enjoy it, let me know down in the comments, and please like, share, subscribe. That stuff always really helps me. If you've got any other things that you'd like me to take a look at in coming weeks and months, any songs or artists or genres you'd like me to pay attention to, then please do let me know. But otherwise, that's all from me for this week, so thanks very much indeed for watching, and I'll hope to see you again next time.